A very good evening to you. You're watching Biz First in Focus. This evening we are going to take your attention to one of the key issues that Sri Lanka is facing at the moment. Through the 2018 budget, the government promised a blue-green economy. We also know that 30% of Sri Lankan employees, or the people who are working in Sri Lanka, consists of farmers, people involved in the agricultural sector. But when it comes to environmental economics and the weather impact the farmers are facing, which in turn affects the economy, does the government, do all the stakeholders put proper attention into these sectors? We are going to talk to Dr. Atula Senaratne, Research Fellow, Environmental Economics at the Institute of Policy Studies this evening. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for being here. Let me very quickly get on to the point straight away. Now, sir, when we speak of factors like climate change, the impact the weather has on agriculture in our country, though people in Colombo and urban areas might understand the true nature of what climate change means, the farmers living in rural areas, the people who it actually matters to, might not completely understand what we mean by climate change. Now, my question to you is a bit different from that. Now, when we say environmental economics and the impact the environmental adversities has on the agriculture, people might not understand it altogether. So before we get on to the topic straight away, let me ask you to provide an explanation as to what environmental economics is.
Sure. Environmental economics is basically a subject that deal with how the our economy is interacting with environment, and the vice versa, that how the environment is having impacting on our economy. So in that case, you know that when our economy takes place in a not a vacuum but in a living environment.
Yeah.
So then we take our resources from the environment, then we emit our waste into the environment.
Yeah.
So that way, so whatever the things we do in the economy affect the environment, and then on the other hand, whatever the change that happens in the environment affect our economy. So the understanding this linkage between these two, economy and environment, is basically environmental economics.
Dr. Senaratne, now we know that during the past few years there have been several major infrastructure projects that have been carried out in the country. Some economists suggested that yes, infrastructure development is needed for a country, while some suggested no, this is not the way to go. But when it comes to the environmental assessments, the studies that are pertaining to the environmental impact of these particular infrastructure projects, they have not been done even at some times. So when you consider the environmental impact of these and the impact it has on the economy thereafter, isn't it important for these stakeholders involved in major projects to look into this aspect as well, the environmental economics aspect of things?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have been having this process of assessing environment from 1980s onwards in Sri Lanka. I think when we introduced this liberal economic policies in 1977, so in a way that our policymakers were somewhat forward-looking to introduce this environmental laws also. So you can see that we have introduced National Environmental Act in 1980. Then we established Central Environmental Authority to implement that. Then we introduced this Marine Pollution Prevention Act in 1981. Then we introduced the Coast Conservation Act in 1981. So very soon, very close. I mean, soon after, soon after our economic policy has changed, they have introduced laws and policies to cover all three major ecosystems: terrestrial, marine, as well as coastal. Yes. So that means with this environmental act, actually we introduced this environmental impact assessment criteria. Yes. So that means whatever the project that we are going to implement, whether it be infrastructure or development project, whatever that it is expected to assess that what the impact of this project on the environment. True. So that process is in Sri Lanka for nearly now 35 years. So I think there could be some pitfalls. I mean that not everything is perfect, but still I think having this process itself is a very forward-looking step, I think. But as you are mentioning, that we need to improve the system.
Understood.
Yeah.
Every time we go and listen to a central bank press briefing, or every time we go and speak to an economist, there are points that are raised to say that because of the adverse weather that we face, the economy is facing this situation currently. And things like that get directly correlated, and they make a similarity there and say this is why this has happened. The weather has impacted this many sectors, so on and so forth. My question to you is, this happens every year, and this keeps on increasing every year if you take a look at it. The rain levels, the precipitation, etc., keeps on increasing. And the government or the other stakeholders do not seem to be understanding. Am I right in saying that, or is there another explanation?
I mean that not to say that government is not understanding this phenomena. I mean that the government is taking a lot of policy measures to address the climate change, and there are some projects going on this area. Then now the national climate change policy is there, and all these things are there. But I think basically what is happening is that climate has happening. I mean the climate disturbance to the economy is a usual thing. I mean that it's not new.
Yeah.
So it has been taking place over, I mean, from a long time back. The issue is that the current changes in climate is going to make much bigger impact.
Right.
So that means if you are taking the example now, the disasters, the earlier it has happened, I mean maybe in few years time, but now we experience it more frequently.
Yeah.
So that means that this climate's impacts on economy is going to be intensified, and more often it is happening in an adverse manner. So that may be the main reason. But if you take this climate's impact on the economy, it has these sudden shocks, that disasters, and then that create life damages and property damages, billions of economic losses. But for that, I think we have a separate programs like disaster management policies and all that. So I think that part is relatively well understood, and I mean at least for some reasons, because of the sudden shocks that create into the economy, there's much more attention on that. But if you take this this climate change, it is ongoing, slowly taking place process. It has other impacts. So I mean that if you take temperature is rising, so that usually have an impact on these crops. So I think this we can call this a slow onset impact. So our understanding of these slow onset impacts and our preparedness to face these slow onset impacts is relatively less compared with this I think disaster aspects of that. I think maybe that way that we need to understand it.
Dr. Senaratna, now another point is when we take a look at the farmers in our country, there are farmers who use traditional methods to identify weather patterns, and there are farmers who actually go on to these available websites, so on and so forth, to identify the weather patterns that they're facing. Now my question to you is, how important is it for these farmers, people involved in the agricultural sector, to actually understand what is happening in terms of the weather? When they know something is wrong, does that have an impact on the economy?
Yeah, definitely, because if you take this farmers' livelihoods is entirely connected to the climate than any other employment or any other industry or economic activity. So whatever the things going to happen in the climate has going to have a direct impact over their livelihood. So I think therefore understanding climate is very much important, much more important than many other occupations or livelihoods. Then if we take this farmers experience, they have been doing this livelihood for I think generations or hundreds of centuries of. So without a proper understanding of climate or how the weather changes, they could not have done this job. So therefore they have a as local experts, the people who are regularly fighting with the nature, they have a, I think, acquired knowledge and then shared with their communities, and then refined practical knowledge on the climate. I think we cannot say farmers as a kind of layman. I think they are a kind of local experts on climate. So I mean maybe that if you take urban educated people and educated person who is working in a I think intellectual kind of job, and if a person and a farmer, I think farmers may be having a much more better practical knowledge about the climate than even that kind of person.
Professor, at that point, let me draw attention to a small commercial break. We'll be right back with BIS First in Focus. On the other side of the break, we'll talk about more on how the climate change affects the environmental economics in our country. Welcome back. You're watching BIS First in Focus. We are in discussion with Dr. Atula Senaratne from the Institute of Policy Studies regarding the environmental economics, and we just before the break we stopped by to speak about how the farmers are affected by this climate change and the adverse weather that the country has been facing in the past few months. Now, Doctor, let me continue from that point and ask you, you said before we went into the break, maybe a farmer has more practical knowledge than a person who is in an office environment in Colombo. While that may be true, Doctor, there might be situations where the farmers need advice or help or support with regard to this climate change and how to identify these things. Now, do you think, as a person who is a research fellow to IPS, do you think the government has ways and means to get this done?
Yes, of course. I think farmers definitely need support at the moment, especially because I think this what is happening in the climate change and the local environment. Let me elaborate this in a bit of this. I mean that when you understand the nature of this farmers' knowledge, only that we can help them.
Sure.
So if you take this farmers' knowledge, they are basically knowledgeable about the local weather patterns. So you know that we have this weather patterns, Maha, Yala and seasons. So all these have been defined by the farmers. It is not experts' knowledge. So even now that the government or that authorities use this Maha, Yala for make their recommendations and all, but this climate knowledge, the understanding of this existing pattern, then the other important part of this farmers' knowledge is that they have some kind of ability to predict what is happening in the weather. That is based on basically there are generations of experience in the local observations. So they know that if something happens in the local environment, if the birds are doing something, then if the animals are behaving some way, that if the clouds are changing, the environment is getting hot, so that way they can develop some kind of local knowledge how it will change the existing weather pattern, especially rainfall. I think you know that the farmers are very much dependent on the rainfall. So the issue now is that this local knowledge used to help them very much in the past. Usually this there are predictions. Based on that prediction only that they carry out their agronomic practices where they do that land preparation. If they think that rainfall is coming and there are clues indicate that they can expect rainfall in a couple of days, so they start their land preparation or other relevant crops, I think crop establishment or whatever the activities. Now the situation has changed. You know that global climate change is being felt by ourselves also.
True.
So that I think all these increasing incidents of disasters and all, I think scientists are now connecting it to the climate change. So the situation is that with these sudden changes in the climate, the farmers' knowledge has become unreliable, because I think they are experience I think relatively stable climate, so their knowledge is much more helpful. Now that sudden changes, they find it sometimes it's difficult to predict and get to know what is happening. The other side is that even in the rural areas, you know that environment has changed a lot. So now that farmers themselves have cleared their forest and all these environments, and then this we are using this, I think, agrochemicals and all that also changed the environment. So due to that reason, I think sometimes their observations, I think they find it difficult to make these local indicators, because if they find that some animal who's living in the surrounding forest has some behavior, but now the forest has been cleared, so so other important aspect is now with this modern farming practices, some of these new young farmers, I think young age farmers, don't have access to this traditional knowledge. So all these due to all these things, I think their local knowledge, I am not going to invalidate that, but I think becoming less reliable than the past. So in that case, we need to help through some kind of producing scientifically developed weather forecasting products and all. So I think that's the way that we need to approach that problem.
Doctor, now another point is that now you mentioned the word scientific. We saw that in the cabinet reshuffle that was carried out as well. They said the cabinet will be reshuffled scientifically. And my point is coming to that. The disaster management aspect of our country plays a very vital role when it comes to reeling back from the effects of a disaster. Now, in the past, we've seen several equipment being brought down into the country to predict weather. We've seen a lot being invested in the disaster management aspect as well as the prediction aspect of it. Now, my question to you is, when you take a look at all of the things that are happening, you yourself said there are these key areas that the farmers are facing when it comes to predicting their own weather through local methods. How important is it for the government to invest in predicting the weather, to bring down equipment, so on, or is the government doing enough at the moment? What is your opinion?
I think if you remember that in this the last budget, that government allocated some reasonable sums for the improving our weather forecasting facilities in the Met Department and all. So that means that government is concerned about this fact. I think not only in Sri Lanka, I think now only even in other countries, people are getting to understand the gravity of the problem. So simultaneously, I should give the credit to that our weather scientists and all, that you can see that significant improvements now in the weather forecasting.
Definitely.
Yeah, so compared with the past, because this weather forecasting business is a very difficult thing actually. So that we cannot blame someone, because one thing is that weather is changing fast. So then other thing is that you need to have to necessary scientific technological background to capture these changes. Then there's a lot of new techniques of weather forecasting, weather new equipments and all these things are there. So I think we need to make more and more investment in this area, not only the equipments, perhaps that we may need to put some investment on human skills. That not only the Met Department, we need to train I think more and more people in the weather related sciences. Even not only I think our universities has a role. So that now that this is going to be a major threat, so we need to face this challenge. So then we need to have some kind of skilled knowledgeable people to face this challenge. So in that case, I think investment should be focused on more wider area, that it's a kind of battle. So we need to prepare our forces to face that.
With that, Doctor, let's go in for another short commercial break. There are three aspects that we have to look into when it comes to environmental economics, that is the land, the marine environment, as well as the coastal environment. We have been speaking about the land environment, the environment on the agriculture on land, but does the government and the stakeholders look into the marine and coastal environmental aspects? We'll talk about it right after this short commercial break. Welcome back to the show. You're watching Newsfirst in Focus. We are going to talk to Dr. Atula Senaratne, a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, regarding the environmental impact on especially the marine life and the coastal areas of our country. Now, Doctor, when we speak about the agriculture or the environmental economics on land, we focus on agriculture. But when it comes to the coastal belt, we have to talk about tourism, we have to talk about waste management, things like that as well. The coastal erosion and the problems surrounding that aspect has been increasing, if my information is right, and we have seen more and more coastal erosion, and there are hotels coming up and various matters happening in the coastal areas that are affecting the economy of the country. We recently saw the president intervening to remove certain hotels down south, in the coastal belt down south. These things also have an impact on the economy of the country. So my question to you is, when it comes to environmental issues in the coastal belt, how does that impact the economy, and where are we standing in terms of that? Are we a country that looks into it well, or are we a country that has forgotten that aspect of things?
We cannot say we have forgotten, but we are doing something. But maybe with the changes happening and that the way that the economy is moving fast and all that, maybe that our work may not be sufficient. So I mean that we need to upgrade our efforts. So if we take this coastal environment, I think we have this coastal regulatory system, and then I mean that sometimes it might not be perfectly, but still I think there's some control is there. But with that all that we know that sometimes everything is not going on the same way that we expect. But with in addition, we have been considering about this marine pollution also. I think that we have Marine Environmental Protection Authority, and they are looking after this marine pollution, controlling marine pollution events and all that. But one point that we need to consider is that this, you know, that coast and marine environment is widely now connected with the more globalized economy. So then I think if you take this marine pollution and all, we alone cannot control that. So that if you take this marine pollution, plastic pollution, all those things, I think of course that our contribution also is there from that. All these things ultimately end up in our seas and coastal, but still that we are located in a main sea lane. So then that has a huge increase in traffic, trade routes and all these things. With that one, of course, I think we are being exposed to this global issues of marine pollution also. So I think we need to face that challenge also.
Being an island, we are one of the main plastic polluters, marine plastic polluters as well. Dr. Senaratne, now it is not like monitoring, though we have very strict laws to monitor marine pollution and issues surrounding the marine environment. It is not like something that is on land. It is not monitored continuously, and the workforce or the human power to actually monitor it is actually lower than what we have on land. And when you take into account all of these factors, now since we are an island, we have to draw attention to our marine life as well as the coastal economy as well. How important is it for us to control what is happening? I'm talking about the tourism industry and the environmental pollution that follows the tourism industry. How important is it for the government to have a hand and a controlling hand over this?
Yeah, I think I think in this case I would like to bring this account, because we always speak about this controlling. Yeah, I think this now I think our environmental policy and architect of our environmental policy is mainly based on this so-called controlling. So we used to call this command and control policies.
Right.
Yeah, but I think there are other ways. There are other kind of policies that I mean that you can provide incentives for people not to not to control or not to ban something, rather than doing that, perhaps that we can control this through some kind of providing some incentives. Maybe that if you are doing good things, we can provide some subsidies. If you are doing bad things, we can fine you, we can tax them. So I think we need to think about that kind of environment also. While certain things we may need to control. So I mean that reasonably, I think I must say that we have a reasonably comprehensive structure of regulations. But regulation are not the best way to address all kind of environmental policies. So in that case, we need to be innovative. So I think most of the other countries are now thinking about something called market-based instruments. So basically, that you are trying to change the people's behavior based on that, giving them incentives not to do or do something good. So that way. So I think at the moment, if we are to think about Sri Lanka's situation, we need to think about that kind of approach to face this, not only the marine, but I think coastal areas, but even in the land-based things. So we cannot, I mean, we cannot say that we cannot stop the development. So I think we need to make the development happen, move forward, but while caring for the environment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atula Senaratne, who is a research fellow at the Environment Economics of the Institute of Policy Studies, for joining us this evening. We have covered a lot. We have covered about the environmental economics related to land, the marine environment, as well as the coastal areas of our country, areas that the government, according to Dr. Senaratne, has looked into and we should look into more in the future to come, and we have to find ways and means to move forward, is what the doctor says. And I hope that everyone watching this show tonight understood something of why climate change is important and why we should get educated on matters related to this. Thank you very much for watching Biz First in Focus. I have been Chaturanga Hapwarachi. Take care and good night.